So in this video I built this hat box specifically with equestrian team competitions in mind. You can see on the sides, all four sides are about the same. Picture frame essentially with a piece of plywood there. On the back, as you might expect, we've got some hinges for the lid. And then on the front we've got two latches to keep the lid secure and a leather strap here to act as a handle. Inside we've got two more leather straps, one on each side, just to keep the lid from falling all the way back. But they are snapped, so for whatever reason you can pop those open and have the lid lay flat essentially. Anyways, inside here we've got a hat rest. I mentioned specifically with equestrian competitions in mind because they typically shape their hat a certain way, and if you just lay it on the table or whatever, it'll ruin the shape. So the proper way to store it is with a hat rest like this, and I'll show you in a different video how I made it. But yeah, it's just curved to fit the shape of a hat, and then for different sizes you can just loosen this, adjust the size, and then tighten it back down. The inside is all tongue and groove cedar, so for long-term storage you can have your hat sitting in the closet and the cedar smell will keep the bugs out. I did put a little cedar oil and rubbed it on here to help boost that effect. And in the back here we've got well, leather care kit, not so much for a hat, but again for the competitions, use the leather care kit for boots and whatnot. And then on this side is a hat sponge, which is critically important for cleaning hats. Up here we've got a little wood panel and snaps on either side with some leather straps holding it up. We take these off, and inside we've got a mirror and a little battery pack that powers some LED lights around the mirror, so in a dark barn or something at the equestrian competitions you can more easily use the mirror. Got a little piece of aluminum here, really thin piece of aluminum to put hairpins on. I know the girls usually use those in their hair, but also to keep their hat in place while they're riding. And then here we've got a little piece of leather again with a button, and that'll just hold any papers. This is just big enough for an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, or obviously anything smaller. And then you just snap this back on, whoops, such like that, and then it won't rattle around and the papers will stay in there. So yeah, in this video I will show you how I made it. So I start by planing down all the lumber that's 1 inch thick down to a 1/2 inch, because it doesn't need to be that thick, and mostly looking at weight savings for this box. And then after you plane, you got to cut off that snipe, as you can see there. And again, mostly for weight savings, I take these 1x3s and cut them down to I believe it's 2.5 inches for the sides. So mostly just weight savings, but also you'll see later they don't need to be that thick anyway. The box being a rectangle, two of the sides are going to be the same length and the opposite two sides will be the same length. So I kept those all in one go, as you can see here. Now, I keep talking about the picture frames, so leave those aside for now. Think about the top and the bottom. I'm going to cut a groove that is the thickness of this plywood with that router bit. I'm going to cut a groove in where the lid and the bottom are going to go, so that way it can kind of slot in there, and you'll see during box assembly what I'm talking about a little more. On the shorter sides, the insides, I'm just going to cut straight through, but on the longer sides I'm going to drill halfway through the boards with this drill bit. That way I can stick the router in and not have to go all the way to the edge. That way you won't actually see this groove from the outside of the box, so I'm just going to do that now. So now I've got the top and bottom of what I referred to as picture frames in the intro cut, so now I just need 8 pieces, 2 on each side for the side of the frames, and they're all going to be the same size. So you can see I'm setting up a little fence here, and then I just take a 1x2 that I've planed down to a 1/2 inch and cut 8 identical pieces. Back at the router now, again, so now I'm writing out the sides, as you can see there, so the plywood will actually set in those for, again, that picture frame side panel bit. To reinforce the joints on those picture frames, I wanted to use dowels, but rather than take them to a drill press and get those holes perfectly lined up, I just set up a fence on the router table again and cut little notches out, as you can see there. And I'm going to do it on the top and bottom of those side pieces, and then also both sides of the top and bottom pieces. And so you'll see in a few minutes when we do the assembly how those dowels go in to help strengthen those joints. One last piece of craftsmanship I want to do to these bottom pieces before I start assembling the box is put an arch in them. You may have seen in the intro the box on the bottom has some arches. Again, for weight savings, but also I just think it kind of looks cool. So I used a 1/4-inch sheet of plywood to give a nice smooth bend. And as you can see here, just take it to the bandsaw, and then because it's bandsawed, it's a little bit of a rough surface. So just like in the Hope Chest video, I'm going to take a piece of sandpaper on a thin board and use that to sand it flush. One last pre-assembly item is I mixed up about 50-50 water and glue, and I'm just painting that on the end grain on these pieces. That way it'll make the glue joint a little stronger once that's actually dried when we assemble these picture frames. And now for the assembly, I'm just going to put some glue on the previously painted end grain there, and then pop them in. I've got this little jig set up to help keep everything clamped and in place. And then going back to that router clip where I put those grooves in, this is where it's going to come in handy. You can see I'm just putting some glue in there and popping those dowels in, and then once it dries, it'll be really sturdy. Now here's something that I actually almost overlooked. The two pieces that are shorter are going to be inside, so I took them to the table saw with my jointing jig to make sure that the side were totally flat and basically jointed, if you know what that means. So that way they'll be able to glue up a lot smoother. And you can see there I'm just marking about 1/3 of the way and using a biscuit joiner, and those biscuits, I've heard mixed reviews on whether they actually make wood joints stronger, but I figured it couldn't hurt, and then also it's going to help me keep those things aligned. So on one end it goes in endwise, and you can see here it's kind of coming in from the side, so that'll help for the assembly. Alright, now that we got the frames assembled, I'm just going to cut up this 1/4-inch plywood into the side panels as well as the panels for the top and bottom. As is with every good woodworking project, an inordinate amount of sanding is in order. So hit it first with I think 100 grit and then up to 220 to get it really nice and smooth. And then I brought it in the shop and used some mineral spirits to both wipe off the any dust, but also to check to make sure there are no scratches or anything. And then I taped up the side. I wasn't sure how good wood glue was going to work if it was stained, so I just went ahead and taped up the sides there, and I put on a preconditioner first, or a conditioner, and then stained it after that, let it sit for a few minutes and wipe the excess off, just like you're supposed to do with stain. Did the same thing with the side panels, except for I used, again, the wood conditioner and then a different color stain. I wanted it to be kind of a light frame outlining the dark plywood centers. As for those plywood centers, I ran a bead of wood glue around the inside and then set the plywood in, and made sure I got all the excess squeeze out of the way so it wouldn't show up out after it was finished, and then made sure I had plenty of weight on it as it dried. Now that I've got the side panels made, I'm going to start working on the bottom of the box. You can see the hat rest sitting there, and I just made a quick template out of that to figure out where the center was, where that hat rest is going to be, and I'll use that in a minute. And now I'm going to cut out the felt and glue it down just using the white tacky craft glue. Now that I got the glue on there, I'm just going to make sure I got plenty of evenly distributed weight to make sure the glue dries evenly, and then take a piece of scrap wood and trim up the corners, and then use that template to make sure that I've got the right spot so I can start trimming out the center bit of felt so I can glue the hat rest down. Now that the bottom panel with the hat rest is drying, I'm going to assemble the rest of the box. So you see I'm just popping in those biscuits, and then I'm going to glue up 3 of the 4 sides using the top panel. It'll also be glued in, but I'm going to use it to keep the whole thing square, and then using also that 4th panel to make sure everything's square. And then I will take off the unglued bits and slide the bottom panel in and glue the whole thing up. Now that the first 3 panels have all set, I'm going to run a bead of wood glue around the bottom slot there and slide that in. Now I'm actually going to take the top panel and put it on, but not glue it yet. Again, just keeping the whole thing square. And once that bottom panel really dries and I'm not going to be able to force anything out of square, then I will glue the top panel on, as you can see now. Just putting a little glue on there, then I'll slide the biscuits in, pop the top on, and clamp it one last time. Now to make the lid, I just made the top a little bit bigger than it had to be and took it to the table saw and cut the lid off. That way I knew it would fit perfectly. Now for the handle, I used a little piece of leather and punched some holes in it, and then I'm going to bolt those in. That's perfectly centered in the plywood, however I forgot to take into account the weight of the lid, so I actually should have moved it up a little bit. But regardless, I'm going to glue in this piece of tongue groove cedar right in the center with the wood glue on the part that's going to be on wood and a little bit of that white tacky glue for the part that's going to be on the felt. I put that one in the center because I'm going to, where the handle comes through, I want to cover up the two little bolts that are going to be there. So you can see that quick clip of just drilling a hole, not quite all the way through, so it's still covered, and that little hole, that little cutout is where the nut is going to be in. I'm just threading that screw there now through the leather, and I put a little epoxy down too to make sure that it basically is never going to come out. And then you'll see here in a second, I think I may have actually forgotten to tape it. Oh no, there it is. A little bit of epoxy on the back side, and then tightening those nuts on, and then that piece of cedar with the hole cut into it. I put a little epoxy actually in that hole to really secure that nut, and then you can see there wood glue on either side, and then I'll put a little tacky glue again on the bottom to hold the felt in, and that'll be the first couple of pieces of tongue and groove cedar. For whatever reason I didn't film the rest of it, but they just click in. If you don't know what tongue and groove is, there's just a groove and a little piece that slips into it, so they all stay nice and neat together, and so I just did that for the rest of the inside of the box. One of the quick weight-saving maneuver I did was plane those down. There's really no reason for the cedar to be in there except for decorative, and then the scent, and you can see I'm applying more cedar oil there to amplify the scent to keep the bugs out. So besides aesthetics and the scent, there's no reason for them to be there, not structural or anything, so I just wanted to make them kind of as thin as possible to help save on weight. I actually probably should have done more. For the lights around the mirror, I found this little channel on Amazon. It's a 90-degree piece of aluminum with a 45-degree channel in the middle, and it's the perfect size to fit some LED lights on, and then it's got this little plastic diffuser, so it's absolutely perfect. I'm just going to build a little square that's going to go around the mirror in the lid. Now to stick the mirror to the back, I just mixed up a big batch of slow dry epoxy and spread it all over, and then set the mirror and the lights in. And now that the lid is done, there's only one more piece to do, and it's that panel that I showed you in the beginning to hold the, well, it's going to hold the battery pack for the LED lights, as well as the papers, and then right here you can see I'm gluing down the little pieces of wood that I'm going to screw the aluminum sheet into. So I just glued all those down and stained them. One thing I didn't film was putting the cedar in there, so the lid actually has cedar in it too, and I just took it to the table saw here to make sure everything was perfectly flush. Kind of went a little crazy with the epoxy on this project, but I wanted these hinges, there's several screws, but I wanted the whole thing epoxied to help kind of spread the stress through it, because it's just attached to cedar, and that's kind of a lot of leverage on that piece. So drilled a bunch of holes and screwed all those hinges in, and each one of them have epoxy on the back side. And one last thing to epoxy is just the battery pack. I'm going to epoxy it to the front panel. And you can see here, like in the clip in the beginning, I've got those little snaps that hold that panel up. So I'm just going to take a really small piece of glue that I've notched a thing out for the leather to sit in, and then glue that down to the lid, and then cut that off, and that'll be what will hold the panel up in place. And one of the last finishing touches here is just to put the snap on this little leather bit to hold the panel on, and then we're pretty much done. And one thing that I forgot to film was the finishing of the project, and it was pretty simple. I just used spray lacquer over the whole thing. So there it is. That's how you build a hat box.